Start clapping.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
We had uncooperative microphones yesterday, but we have a professional show here. Glad of that. So,
Yeah.
all right. So some of you know me. I'm David West Reynolds, and I'm especially grateful to Wonderfest because I got my start here. And the people that run Wonderfest were the ones that brought me from the world of just marveling at the things that I saw on the screen to beginning to understand how they were made. And it was Lee Staton's class at IUS in Star Wars and Star Trek that opened my mind to seeing the entertainment that I enjoyed as not just entertainment, but as also a craft that I could respect. And now to come into that and see it from behind the scenes as well, I still enjoy it just as much as entertainment, but to that is added the respect for the craftsmanship. So the start that I got from Wonderfest I always loved the worlds of Star Wars, and some of you will have heard the stories of how I ended up going to Tunisia as an archaeologist and tracking down the lost filming locations of the first Star Wars movies. That made me the only person in the world with the GPS coordinates of the Star Wars locations exactly when George Lucas needed them to go back and shoot the prequels.
That's awesome.
So that's how I ended up getting hired as a location scout for Lucasfilm, and they found that this kid is a walking encyclopedia of Star Wars, and that was just what they needed at Skywalker Ranch at the time. So they brought me in and had me start writing Star Wars reference books in a way that had never been done before. They wanted to flesh out the stories behind them, and they thought an archaeologist would be the perfect person to do that. We had a picnic, and I found out that he was Roger Christian. And I said, don't you have an Oscar for decorating the sets on Star Wars? And he said, I think I do, something like that. And I said, well, maybe you could answer some of my questions. And
Some.
many. His was the untold story. Charlie Lippincott, the publicist for Lucasfilm back in the beginning, had done a wonderful job of interviewing everybody he could talk to. So we got a lot of pieces of those interviews in the early publicity elements for Star Wars. So you see them on the back of the Topps cards and everywhere else. And the making of Star Wars book was written largely on the transcripts from the Charlie Lippincott interviews. But Roger had been missed out. We were in England, and I guess Lippincott.
No, he interviewed me.
Like he didn't
And it got
cover it
lost.
properly.
No, it
got
did.
lost? Is that
No, it was lost. They never found it.
So-
And his wife has a copy of it. And she said, I've got hundreds of things, and I'm still at her to try to get it. I wanted it for the book, and she said, I've got so many, and then when he died. So, no, it was lost. It was done fully, comprehensively, and I know that from Charlie.
I'm still asking him questions 20 years later because Star Wars was such an incredibly richly creative work that you can put that much attention to it. So I've gotten to ask him questions for 20 years worth, but now it'll be your turn because this is the man who created those things and brought the used universe to life.
I did. With no money. That's the thing. Now I know why I've come out and he forced me to write the book, which I've written, and unfortunately the hardbacks have now finished and they're about to publish a soft cover, so I'm waiting to get those. But I realized as a legacy, and it had never been covered, that I'd better put it all down, that and Alien as well. And I was working on a film called Lucky Lady in Mexico, and it was a huge movie, and we were converting old Mexican buildings to rum-running buildings. And Lucky Lady was written by Gloria Willard Hike, who wrote American Graffiti and wrote some of the characters for George uncredited in Star Wars. So they said, you've got to come down and meet Roger and John Barry, the designer, because Fox, I think everyone knows now, everyone turned this film down. No one wanted it. No one wanted a science fiction film. There was no box office. And Alan Ladd went against the Fox board and said, we're going to consider this. And so they estimated it would make $12 million at the box office. And they divided that by 3 and said to George, we'll make the film if you can do it for $4 million. Well, Gary was doing all of the kind of estimates in studios in America, and there were none free, and it came out at 8. The head of Fox in London picked up, and we needed work in England, and said, we can do it for 4, the exchange rates, and we've got empty studios. So that was it, and George came down, I was digging salt, making a salt factory, and being George, just George and Gary in his plaid shirt, jeans and white sneakers, that was what he always wore, and looked at this salt factory, and then I was shoveling salt, so being George, he picked up a shovel and started shoveling with me, and said, I want to make this science fiction film, but I want to do it like a spaghetti western. And I was truthful. I said, listen, I've watched every science fiction film. I'm an avid reader of science fiction, which never went down well in England at that time. I was always told, it's not Shakespeare, is it? There was a kind of supercilious attitude to everything like that. And I said, George, I'm sorry, but everything I see is over-designed, it's all clean, it doesn't look real, no one goes to those movies to watch them, and I think it should be like an old ship that's dripping oil and being repaired by the owner and kept going. I only realized then, when I finally read the script in August when I was hired, that I described the Millennium Falcon exactly.
That's awesome.
I was watching it last night, and I remember, Luke saying, this is a pile of junk. And in London, we then found out how little money there was to make this film, and most of the art department said, this can't be done. We don't have enough time, because we were shooting in March, and this was January the 6th when we started. Well, for any film needs longer preparation than that. So I just thought, this is a dream job. I loved the script, and I knew a lot about mythology, so I recognized what was there. Fox still would not trigger the movie. We moved, George and Gary and myself and John Barry and one art director went into a tiny studio in England, and I'd done my breakdown of what's required and said, I can't do it, so I'm going to have to think outside the box here. And John Barry realized, and you probably all know, it's based on Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa's Two Squabbling Peasants. And the story is, if you don't know this film, the story is 2 squabbling peasants, one tall, one short. They get caught up in a war that's nothing to do with them. They're taken prisoner, they're dumped into a desert, they have a fight in the desert and split up, and they come together because a princess has to fight against a big, powerful overlord who's trying to take over her kingdom. And that's Star Wars' exact journey. And so he'd taken, and those 2 peasants are the minor characters, but they tell the story. And Kenny turned up, we tried to lift him in. He was so heavy. He looked at both Bill and I said, oh, I've got heavy bones. He was a comedy actor. They had a mini-tones with Jack Purvis. So we thought, okay, how can we do this? Because he couldn't move it, he couldn't do anything, and he could turn the top of it. And then we got his boots, and we stapled them inside the bottom of the legs, and he put his feet in the boots, and he still couldn't move it. And then in this junk pile I bought, there was a fighter pilot's harness, so we stapled it inside, and he could wear Kenny wooden one like a rucksack. And George and Gary were there, and he took 3 steps before he fell over and was calling at me out. It's, as I said, it's probably the most auspicious moment on Star Wars, because we knew we could make the movie. We didn't know, if you make a period film, you go to the museum or art galleries and you look at books, you have everything. With this, there was no reference to go on, nothing had been made. So we had a prop master who's in charge of the studio, who's a wonderful man, Frank. He did Stanley Kubrick's movies, he did David Lean's. I mean, he could move an army. He was an extraordinary human being. So he said, "What do you want, boy?" I was called boy. And I said, "Clear out this problem. There's no chairs, curtains, there's no furniture, nothing. Clear it out. I'll tell you what we're going to do." So he did. This low loader backs in. He came down to look, standing by me. This low loader comes in, roped on, is like as much airplane junk as you could ever see, and there were jet engines stuck in there and everything. I'm standing there, and it drives in, and he says, "You know, you're mad, boy." I thought, yeah. But this was Frank. He was one of the few supportive people on that film. He said, "Boy, in my office, I'm putting the tea on. I want you to tell me what you need to do." So I said, "We need to train prop men how to break down all these engines. Have got to be broken into components, because if you look at an aircraft, there's 2 or 3 duplicates. People have tried to stick it in. You can't do that. Even Doctor Who, you have to layer it like engineering." So the first set we did was the Millennium Falcon cockpit. John Barry had hired Harold Lang, and to put this in perspective, to try and get the crew to understand what he was doing, George showed 3 films to the crew. The first one was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is Sergio Leone's classic Western. He was pointing out the dust and the dirt and the costumes, everything. 2001, obviously, because you have the contrast of Tatooine and the kind of organic nature of all of the lower rebels, and then the Death Star, which is the 2001 structured Cold World. And the third film was Satyricon, which completely confused everybody. But there are huge sets in it that are all aged, and but they're never pointed out. And George kept saying, "I'm going to make a documentary, I'm not making a film." And he wanted to shoot it like a documentary to make it real. And nobody understood at all. But we kind of got stuck in, and he hired Harold Lang, who did 2001.
Who was brilliant for his control panel design. Like one of his specialties was doing control panels.
Yeah.
So all of it, Discovery, cockpit, things like that. That's all Harold Lang.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the contrast, as Roger's explaining. The Millennium Falcon cockpit, if you look closely, it's got that 2001 look, but you get into the hold, and the hold looks more wild and organic, and that's Harold Lang versus Roger Christian approach. And after he finished.
Well, no, it was before that. I used to go down and see. I art school, and I was a rebel always, so I had hair down here and Cuban boots and the whole thing. He was like dressed in all the art about was suits and ties at that time. And I come in and I say, "I'm going to mess this up." And he'd look at me like, "Oh." And eventually he said, "Okay, boy, do what you want." So I got fighter pilot seats, and I then got. We used one of the pistons from C-3PO, because I thought, he's got to pull into hyperspace. How am I going to do that? We stuck that in, and that never worked. I had to ask Harrison to make that work for me. He was great. Harrison, I don't know if you know, he was a carpenter, and he came when he first arrived and said, "Is there anything I could do?" And we said, "Do you want to help make the sets?" And so we put him in the carpenter shop. He was building sets. He was happier doing that than mixing with producers and stuff. Yeah, he saved me my bacon twice. And we got it finished, and I thought, this looks pretty cool. But again, it was crossing fingers. George, come down and have a look at the first set. Big smile. And I said to him, I like to make things personal. People fly these things, they live in them. I noticed in American Graffiti, he had those big fluffy dice in Ron Howard's car. And I said, "He's a gambler, we should hang some dice." That was a good idea, so I got big fluffy ones down to little silver ones. My silver were my choice, but I let George choose, and he chose the silver ones. We hung them in. We had the director of photography, who's a very important person, was grumpy and fell out with George on the very first morning of shooting, and they conversed from then on through Gary Kurtz. they're in the first shot in Star Wars, there's two, and then the DP took them out because he thought they were in his way, and they never went back.
They just disappeared.
Disappeared. I was telling this story on Reddit, on Ask Me Anything once, and she said, there's a text just come in saying, have you seen the Vanity Fair cover for the what was the first one? The Rise of Skywalker. What's the first one?
Force Awakens. Force Awakens.
Force Awakens. So they said the dice are in that photograph that Andy Leibovitz did. So I went and got it, and we looked, and there they were. But they were also gold. Mine was silver, but the lighting made them look gold. He'd gone out and had somebody track some down. They hung them in there. He cut that scene out, so because they weren't in that film. But then they remembered, and when Luke brings them and gives them to carry as a remembrance of Han Solo once he's died, they bring the dice then and give it. So these little things we did kind of became echoes. And it was the same with, you went there and you saw the cantina. When we were there, it was a dusty square, and John Barry, the designer, could not afford to do Tatooine, so he designed the Little Prince for Stanley Donen before that, and said, George, if we go to Tunisia, it's very, very inexpensive, it's not far from London, crews are cheap, and I think it's Tatooine. And so George went, and there it was. He didn't do anything but add some domes on the top outside the cantina and made a door. The rest of it, I dressed electronics and vehicles and whatever we could put in. And in the square was a beautiful olive tree, and it completely spoiled the look. And so John Barry drew a crashed spaceship the size of a 747.
It's really huge, right?
It was huge. And that hid the olive tree. We couldn't cut it down. These are poor farmers, you know, and it was a living for someone. It's never really noticed. They just walk past it backwards and forwards. But I thought, what am I going to do here? And we had found, it was the most expensive thing the art department got, was a press that could make like PVC pressings that we made C-3PO from, but the Death Star was made out of panels that were just flexible panels, but they were stapled onto a wooden frame, and it created that whole Death Star really cheaply. I grabbed a load of those. I thought, these will be good. I was loading scrap onto trucks, which again, they thought I was mad. Why are you putting scrap to take to Tunisia? But there wasn't any there. There was nothing. Everything was used. And I got up on a ladder and stuck these panels on and burnt it with a torch. I did it myself, and then we painted it down, and it became that crashed spaceship. And at the same time, John had drawn the skeleton when R2-D2 and C-3PO land of a dinosaur, of an animal, huge. I thought that was really cool because it gives a history to a planet when they're there. And I said, sorry, that's beyond my budget, I can't do that. And the prop man one day said to me, here, there's a torch, go in the attic, I got to clear everything out, I need the space now, go and see if there's anything there. I wish I knew what I did now. There was the bounty from Mutiny on the Bounty, the model, a huge one they used on the tank. They all got junked.
Just clearing all that out.
Clearing out, everything got junked. There were old
coincidence.
film cans and so much stuff. I didn't have a time, because I saw a full-size dinosaur with fiberglass from this film. One of our dinosaurs is missing. And I got in the parking lot, there it was. So I said, stick that on the truck, and we put it into the desert. This is how we linked up, because at the end of the shoot, Robert Watts, who was the production controller, said, we can't afford to take that back. I just leave it there. I said, you sure? It's fiberglass, leave it in the desert.
Because it was going to be thrown away anyway.
It would have been junked, yeah. So
Like, bring it all the way home,
yeah.
throw it away.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
And you found it. And Gil Taylor walked over to him and said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm lining up the shot. He said, that's my job, I do that. You look after the actors, I'll do that. And that was it. That was where the fractions began. he's an independent filmmaker, that's what you do, you know. And this film was, as you know, John Jimson, when he edited the film together during the shoot, he complained so much to Fox, the special effects complained so much, Gil Taylor complained so much, that Alan Ladd came over ostensibly to fire George off his own movie.
It was that close.
And Alan Ladd was wise, and when we took him round the sets, he thought this is quite what they're saying, there's something here. And then George explained, and the English editor had cut it like a conventional film, big wide shot, mid shot, tight shot, over the shoulder, all conventional. George never did that, it was documentary style, and he explained that to Alan Ladd, and actually Gary Kurtz told me, I didn't know this, they screened the footage that the editor had done in Pinewood in the theatre. And of course you imagine, so Dave Prowse is going, I come from Somerset, so how do we go now? I got to get the stormtroopers going. He thought it was his voice being used. The stormtroopers were stuck together, they were clanking on the set, nothing was working, robots were being pulled along. It didn't look very good. I didn't know this, but he said Alan Ladd watched it, came out, said to Gary, how much have you spent so far? How much is there rest to spend for the effects? And he said, I'm going to walk around the stage and I'll come back and tell you at the end of it whether you're going to continue or we're going to dump this. And he just trusted George. So, you know, George says now, I owe the film to Alan Ladd, really, that we actually got it made. It was an interesting story, and I knew Excalibur, and that's the icon of that legend, is the sword. It's got the power, and I thought this will be it. And I've got to justify this weapon and these Jedis. I couldn't find anything, and the time was getting nearer to Tunisia. And then I tackled Luke's binoculars, and I had some junk camera bits, still camera and a movie camera, and so I took 3 pieces of them and stuck them together with super glue again, and I thought that looks okay.
But you had done quite nice drawings, actually, of binoculars.
That was the only thing I did.
Was that the only?
It's the only drawings I ever did. I thought, how am I going to make this work? So I did drawings.
So and, if there had been time to make the movie conventionally, you would have been able to build them according to your design, right? There wasn't all the money. There was no money to do it. So but that was in your head, though. That's cool.
Yeah, and I thought, to make the audience understand what they are, I'll get 2 camera lenses and stick them on the front. So I went to the camera hire shop that his friend David French ran. They sold cameras, everything. We got all our equipment from them, and I got the lenses that I could stick on the front. And I said, David, listen, I've got to make a weapon. Is there anything you can think of I might be able to look at? And he said, what about a torch? And you've seen because there's no reference, everything else, there was something in Ralph McQuarrie I could hang on to, but they look like lances, and actually Darth Vader and the Stormtroopers had them in Ralph McQuarrie's versions. The special effects made them up turn like blank torches, and they look terrible. I think
George, how many people have seen those prototype lightsabers that John Steers' special effects team made up? And this is back when the lightsaber was wielded like a rapier. It was a one-handed weapon, because in the early visions, you had a shield too. There were shields with the lightsabers in the earliest vision of this, because they were still searching for what's the archetype that you pattern it on. And so the stormtroopers, she had shields, and they had a one-handed lightsaber. Well, that made it this little thing. There's no room for any individuality. You see in the famous Ralph McQuarrie painting where Darth Vader in his prototype version is bearing down, and the early Luke Skywalker character's got breathing gear. You'll see the sabers, but like Roger said, there's not much design there. There's sort of like a little radar dish on top of a pommel it just looks like a flashlight. And so when John Steers faithfully represented anything you could get out of those Ralph McQuarrie paintings, it was just completely uninspiring. And that's what it was going to be. That would have been the lightsaber. But Roger was the one who was thinking Excalibur. Like, this is not just another piece of the film, like we need a light switch and we need a battery. He was thinking we need a symbol. So what's worthy of being that symbol? And the pieces that John Steers made would have worked fine. They looked decent, they were well made, but they didn't have that iconic symbolism. And so it was, you brought that to the search.
Well, he said go and look under the shelf. There's a load of boxes there, because he hired out, the Graflex camera was a press camera that was used in America and Britain, and it worked. It was a beautiful object, and it had the ability to take a shot, and then quickly put another bulb in, so it was like early paparazzi. He had a load of those because he rented them out to period films. And he said, look in that box, and I pulled the first box out, and there in the tissue paper, it was like slow motion music rising. There was this object, which I thought, there it is, this is beautiful, I could use it like this, because you didn't know what it was. I got 3 of them, I raced back to the studio. I had some T-strip left over from the blaster that put round, so I thought, if I make a handle, that'll change it. I stuck that round, and I was always taking things apart in the office, and I'd taken apart I think it's a Texas Instrument calculator, and inside there was a bubble strip that illuminated the numbers and magnified them, and it fitted beautifully in the clip. It was the only thing I didn't like. There was a clip that clipped it on, and I thought that looks like something the Force would work. And called George over, and it was very heavy. And again, this huge smile, I mean, he just held it, and I thought, there it is. So all he wanted was a D-ring or a clip on the end. The first time we see it is on Luke's belt in the desert. So I'd hired a friend of mine who made metal sculptures out of scrap. And it was the first appointment ever in the industry. We hired him as a special assistant prop maker to me. Again, he started, there was no money for equipment, it was a new prop thing, so he had a box of stuff at home, and he brought it in and stuck the D-ring on the end of it. And in another of our chocolate biscuit munching, tea drinking in the morning, there was a long discussion about the blade, because no one knew how to do it. And I'd done some art installations. We painted with front projection paint that glowed. So I suggested that, and again, oh, yeah, you do that. There was a big meeting whereby I explained to the special effects boys that if we just got a wooden dowel and painted it, we could stick it in my handle, and I made them a second handle that they could drill out and do that with. Again, the DP, that won't work, I don't want it on my set, the lighting's going to spoil my beautiful set lighting. And then George overrode and she said, no, do it. And so John Steers here, where he was clever, this is one that was made recently that was quite interesting, but it's exactly illustrated. It's not the right lightsaber, this is Obi-Wan's, but he put a motor inside the Graflex, and then he set it off center a little bit, so it kind of vibrated. I think this one might work. It just brought it to show me, yeah. And if you do it with a camera light on it, this glows immediately, and it worked. So the other thing that the decision was made was that based on the samurai fights, the swords shouldn't go through each other, even though they're light blades, they should hit. So when Alec Guinness and Dave Prowse did the only lightsaber fight, they were hitting each other with it. They broke so many, I can't because they were only wooden dowels, but it kind of worked.
It lights up when you take a flash of you holding it.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, the camera sees it differently.
The camera sees it, you know, really, I think it kind of, it somehow gets through to the audience that you're believing everything, and that was the goal, really, to try to make that happen.
And doing it for real, like you said, his guns would fire blank charges. So when Luke and Leia are in the chasm, where they're going to do the swing, and they're fighting it out with the stormtroopers, these blanks are going off, and it gives the actor something to react to, but you see a flash also, and then as that battle goes on, it's filling up with smoke. So by the time they're going to do their swing, there's a lot of smoke, and you get the feeling that like a battle has happened here.
Well, there was a problem with
A little bit.
Well, the first time they're used by the stormtroopers, and the ejector on the side is on the left. And when they were firing, they were hitting the other stormtroopers, the blanks when they came out. So the kind of primitive health and safety at that time banned us from doing it anymore. And George had to put the flash on afterwards.
So that's why it's in some scenes and not others.
Yeah,
That got banned.
yeah.
But it looked so good.
I know it does. That's part of the reason of doing it with real guns, because you can do it. They're blanks. They're perfectly safe if they're correctly inspected.
And even as a kid, I noticed, like your point about, you said you didn't like the science fiction guns because they're lightweight. They look like they have no presence. Even as a kid, I remembered when Leia gets tossed the blaster in the detention block, when they're down in the cell bay, and you see her catch the blaster, you can see it. It's got some real heft. And that's, I mean, a weapon, you pick up a weapon and it's got physical presence.
Yeah.
And that's just, the actor, you can't fake that the way it's held. So I could see that even as a kid, that like, it has that presence. And I think it made a big difference.
Yeah, and each one kind of, it's like the bowcaster fitted a tall, hairy Chewbacca, and then I kind of tried to distinguish the characters, which is why with the Tusken Raiders, I gave them, I found in Baptist that Tokyo Warrior stick, and I thought, this is really great, and I had to change it, so I put an old piece of they made up a medieval mace in Baptist, and I drilled the end and put that in there, so it changed it. We only had one of those.
This baffled me for years because it only came out late. We finally figured out it's a Fijian Totokyo warrior club. That's the wooden part of a gaffy stick. The other end is this mace. But until I talked to Roger, I never understood because it's a really badly made mace.
Yeah.
And it's a background mace that Baptiste had for when you've got 100 people in the army and the barbarians are running around or whatever. It's just for the background, so that's why it's crudely made. So I could see like it's supposed to represent a mace, like a traditional mace, and yet you could see the weld marks on it. So that was fascinating.
Well, they were kind of wild people who lived in the desert. They wouldn't have sophisticated.
Yeah, so it fits perfectly.
Yeah.
It was very curious about, because this prop shows this really fine detail where it's all carved out around the club,
Yeah.
the ring around the spike. The Fijians carve it very finely, and yet this other part was very crude. So it works perfectly for the Tusken Raiders, but I wondered, how did the prop maker do that? And so it wasn't until he explained that Baptiste has this range of everything. If you need an army, we've got hundreds of these low-grade versions.
Yeah.
If you need hero versions, we've got these up here.
Yeah, exactly.
Putting all the pieces together is possible in a place like that, where you could be serendipitous. You can't go in and say, I want this, this, and this. You don't know until you see it. So I think the opportunity to browse like that was something that enriched the film.
Yeah, it was. And then we gave them the old kind of blunderbuss as well, so I thought that would be suitable. And the advantage was, and this is why there's so little, the guns, like all of the Sterlings, when we finished shooting, all went back. They were rented and we couldn't afford to buy them, so we had the duplicate ones that were made for stunts and stuff. Everything was destroyed or went back afterwards. But that was a way that we could get it done. There were so many things like that, and it was just endless stories. The garbage room was particularly difficult because they were going to be in water, and you usually use polystyrene lumps, which I could paint, but it breaks and it would be white. So I found a way to inject it. I got every bit of rubber, anything I could find that was soft that would do it. And then, of course, that huge pole that Harrison has to hold the walls as they come in. I had bought so much drain piping and water piping because it was cheap. I had racks of it. So I got 2 of the drain pipes and found some piece, I don't know what it was, that I could stick it together. It was so long it would never stay still. And that was the second time when Harrison came down. I said, listen, I need your help again here. He's great. He always says, oh, don't worry, I'll deal with that. And made it work. So
some of the section where Arrow Benjamin.
I just use